Today's Energy Central webcast entitled, Preparing Investor-Based Resources for Regulatory Changes, Efficient and Cost-Saving Strategies for NERC Compliance Programs. I'm happy now to turn the floor over to our first speaker, Jim Statton, to kick things off. Jim, welcome to the event. You have the floor.
No, thank you very much. Thanks for that good introduction. Welcome to everybody today. I want to start with some congratulations in order to the renewable generation industry, which I assume who most of you are, or at least related to it. You've managed to become a tipping point in your contribution to the bulk system reliability. And you've managed to grow your segment of the industry to the point where everyone is taking notice, even your friendly neighborhood regulators. So now what? Inverter-based resources are a big enough piece of the pie to draw the rigors of regulation. Depending on the size and configuration of your assets, you'll be adding the requirements of the North American Electric Reliability Corporation's reliability standards to your training and operations. Today, we're going to cover a bit of what that means. We're also going to say something rarely heard from our segment of the industry, which is mandatory reliability standards are incredibly important, but complying with them is not incredibly difficult. So why now? One of the triggers for doing the webinar today is, we've heard that some of you out there have apparently limited the size of your facility to avoid the historic threshold of mandatory registration with NERC as a generator operator. When I saw that, it was like, really? Give me a break. There is apparently some skewed impressions of just how bad these regulations can be. We've worked with dozens of developers and operators to get past that. Next slide, please. And we've gathered some of that experience with these examples. The reality is the majority of the NERC requirements are not that different from normal operations. They consist of data that is fairly easy to find. When training is required, the templates are available and ready to go. When component lists are needed, the spreadsheets are provided. The scope of generator protection system components, for example, isn't extensive, and the lists all pretty much look alike. The same goes for facility ratings. Not too exciting. If you get the right people involved at the right time, they can knock out those two lists in about 15 minutes. And we've just taken a big step to handling two of the most historically violated standards. These standards have been in place since 2007. The solutions to compliance are well understood. So, reality of additional tasks. So you have to do something, but how additional are they really? It's a little experiment. Let's assume there are no NERC requirements and your generator is about to be up and running. You're going to operate it safely and reliably. If there are no NERC requirements, will you disregard cyber protection for your facility? Probably not. Would you not maintain and test the components that protect your investment? I believe you would. Would you not respond to operating instructions from your transmission operator? And I can safely say you will. For some organizations, for example, with the NERC cybersecurity infrastructure protection standards, they're a joke. Their existing internal security measures are far more rigorous, especially given the fact that every IBR facility is low risk under the NERC standards. There are all kinds of cybersecurity programs out there. You understand what you have before you make some kind of decision about how serious and burdensome the NERC standards are. So next slide, please. So approaches for what not to do, and this is based on our experience over the years. We talked about limit the size of your facility to avoid mandatory reliability standards. I have trouble giving my mind around doing something like that. Next. Ignore the contributions of your OEMs and EPC contractors. This is especially important for individuals, companies that have projects under development. For some of the data that's required for the NERC standards, the OEMs and the EPC contractors, they know that inherently. If you get it to them, your request early, they could help you out rather than try to track them down after the fact and saying, oh, wait a minute, we have to fill out these forms and do this data request. It's much easier to do ahead of time. It's real easy. And matter of fact, if I was doing a contract to build a facility, I would include this in the deliverables, that you will give me this data, and I'm going to be ready to go on day one. Next bullet. I hear this a lot. I'm of an older generation. I hear this a lot from younger folks when faced with a problem. Well, we'll figure it out. Well, this is exactly what you don't want to do. You want to figure it out soon, not later, and not when it needs to happen. For a new facility coming online, you need to be compliant on day one. That's not the day that you start looking at compliance issues and getting your procedures and processes in place. It's the day you're done. Get that ahead early, get it done early. One of the things that's going to happen after you first start up is you're probably going to get audited within the next year or so. The best response to having an audit response or an audit request is like, whatever, you've got it. You have the information, you keep it, and audit is not something you have to get ready for. It's something that you submit material for what you already have. Next slide. Wait until the facility is up and running. I've talked about that before. We've seen that a lot. We've had calls, some of us, me personally, call from some happy new investors, operators, developers. Hey, we just started up our power plant and now we need to look at these NERC standards. And I'm like, no, you should have done that already. So you already start behind. So what do you do now? You start filing self-reports because you're out of compliance sometimes. So you can avoid all of that. And I think that contributes to the impression of how burdensome some of these things are because you go about it wrong. All right, next bullet. Assume your variable resource contributes less to reliability. That goes back to our first slide about the bigger slice of the pie that you all represent. And once again, had many conversations. Hey, I've got my 80 megawatt wind farm, my 100 megawatt solar farm. My balancing authority is so huge, they don't even know who I am. How can I be that significant to reliability? Well, you've reached the point to where now the regulators look at you collectively. When they look at you, they don't see an 80 megawatt wind farm or a 100 megawatt solar plant. They see gigawatts of power. And you're part of that group. And they want certain things to be addressed. Standards apply to everyone, have to be complied with. That doesn't mean you have to comply with them in the same way. We'll talk about that a little bit too. Next bullet. Don't keep the reliability considerations to a side item. Ideally, in your day-to-day operations, this should just happen naturally. And we're not talking about huge amounts of data. We're talking about logbook entries, communications, periodic training, keep records of it. This is all evidence and easily maintained. Once again, it's not like, oh, wait a minute, let's have a timeout this week. Let's look at where we are on our reliability standards requirements. No, it needs to be just part of what happens naturally. Okay, next bullet. And fail to integrate considerations into routine processes. It should be a routine. It shouldn't be a standalone side item. And it doesn't have to be, and it's not that difficult if you take the time to build what you need to do into your operations. Been around reliability standards for a long time, and I don't care who you are, transmission, generation, balancing authority, reliability standards, the requirements are either a procedure to do something or evidence you did something. It's one of those two things. You keep track of when that happens, and you're going to have it archived, and when somebody wants to look at it, whether it's a spot check or an audit or a data request, you'll have it and say, here it is. All right, next slide. So there is some good news. Part of that, when you become a registered entity, you'll become part of the registered ballot body. Standards need not be surprises or something you can't live with. We've heard it over and over again. Hey, NERC has developed these reliability standards. They've created them. And no, they don't. NERC does not create reliability standards. Industry volunteers, like any of you on this call, that's who creates standards. And a matter of fact, that's who votes on them to see whether they're approved or not. And we're talking about new standards, we're talking about revisions, updates, and which goes to my next good point. NERC is excruciatingly transparent. everything they do, standards authorization request for drafting team members, versions posted, comments considered, it's all easily available. It's there. Nothing happens in a back room. And if you know where to look, and you don't have to look a lot, you just have to know where to look, you'll never be surprised. As a matter of fact, you'll find out likely years ahead of time of when you have to be ready for something new that's coming down the pike. Higher valuation of assets. That's one of the things, didn't get on the slide, but it is. I mean, if I was an investor and I'm looking to invest in a facility that's say 80 megawatts here, and oh my gosh, we have to register as a GOP, we got all this stuff. And over here, I've got someone that says, oh, I'm 70, I'm under the bright line criteria as of today. I'm thinking, well, there are these requirements that helps ensure the continuity of my investment through protections of, around the protection system components, cybersecurity. The more my facility's up and running, the more valuable it is. And so I'm going to pick the one that has to comply with the standards if I'm going to doing evaluation of one of the two. And one example of that, and I picked one here. I didn't put it on the slide, but I'll talk about it briefly. There's a standard PRC 24-3, frequency and voltage protection. It involves frequency and voltage excursion ride-through capabilities. It's a setting on an inverter for the people on this call. You need to find out what that is and to see if your equipment can satisfy the no trip zone in that standard. If there's an excursion in frequency, something is wrong. And the value of your contribution and your megawatts just increased exponentially if you're in a market situation. If there's any time you want to be up and running, it's then. And guess what? Here's a standard that says this is where you need to operate in this no trip zone for these excursions. And that's an extremely valuable thing, not just for reliability, but for economics as well. So what's good for your generation investment is good for reliability. Okay, next slide. So we talk about there are burdens. Okay, it's not nothing to be looped into this group. But okay, need for documentation of evidence. That's one. List like completed work orders for protection system maintenance I put as one of the things I was talking about. If there wasn't a standard, would you not bother to track this activity? Yes, you would. The only difference is that somebody wouldn't be asking you for evidence. So it's nothing new. It's just archiving things that happen anyway. Monitoring the changing landscape, I will agree. The standards are constantly changing. From the SIP things to the cold weather requirements to the coming registration, particularly for the IBRs under 75 but over 20, it's coming. But once again, it's extremely transparent. What's coming, what's being talked about. You can see what other people are saying. If somebody has a problem with a standard or a revision or a requirement, and you hadn't thought of it, somebody else might have, and you can read what they say, and you say, oh, I agree with that. Yeah, I have a problem with that too. I'm going to vote accordingly. Just an example, NERC sends out a standards compliance and enforcement bulletin, and you don't have to research proposed changes in their status. They'll send it to you. Not a big ask. Audit spot checks and alerts. These primarily consist of data that is fairly common, but needs to be gathered for a specific need. And that's just what data requests are. Hey, we need to, there's an excursion, we need to know what you experienced. What did it look like where you were on the system? Did you notice anything? Were there any communications? Things like that. Once again, logbook entries of communication. In my experience as a generator operator, that's a gold standard of evidence, is my logbook. Okay, so owners and operators, you need to be confident in your value and contributions because you are. And that's why we're having this discussion today. You have become a critical enough mass that, oh my gosh, now these standards are going to have to apply to you. So do these things, you properly account for those contributions as per the operating characteristics. Those are the mod standards, a simple summary here. Ensure communication is accurate and effective. The COM standards, TOP standards for communication, cybersecurity risks. You're going to do that anyway to some degree or another. And the generator assets, the PRC standards to protect the assets. And we talked about that. Those are all extremely valuable, extremely important, and really contributory to the value of your facility and to reliability as a whole. Okay, next slide. So it's not a blank sheet. Leverage what you have. And we've included some examples of here. I talked about the EPC contractors. We've helped so many people fight through this. I have to have a list, a component list for my facility ratings, which is an odd thing for generators to do, but they do it, and it's proven to be pretty valuable for planning purposes. It is a hard thing to track down after the fact, or if you're someone that bought an existing facility from somebody else and they didn't save their paperwork, it's like, oh my God, I have to go back and do this. But if you're in a development phase and you're talking to the manufacturer of the equipment you have, they easily have this equipment or this information. Once again, it would surprise me. You talk to the right person, knock it out over lunch. Thank you. I've got my list. I'm going forward. That list tends to look a lot like the PRC 005 protection system maintenance and testing list. They tend to look kind of the same, a few differences. Knock those two out over lunch, buy the Guy burger, and you're done. Include documented evidence of like voltage drive-through capabilities. We talked about that. It's a number, and your manufacturer OEM person, they know what that is. It's not something you have to research and test. It's there because they've had to build it in to the inverter. Just find out what it is. And either it meets the criteria or it doesn't. And if you don't meet the criteria, that's not necessarily a violation. You just have to tell somebody, your regulator, hey, I know this is the no trip zone, but this is the equipment I bought. This is what I've got. I'll look at fixing it down the road, but for now, this is what I have. You do that and you're compliant. Interconnection studies. Just about everybody that builds a new facility and comes online, they have one of these things done. In the process of that happening, there's data available to satisfy some of the mod standards. It's in there. Short circuit studies, steady state studies. What does it mean for your generator to be at this point on the system? If it's there, then it's not something, once again, this is a hard thing to go back and find after the fact. It's a really easy thing to build in to the studies when you're having them done or you're reviewing them with the people that did it. Okay, next slide. Make manufacturer data required. I'm going to sign a contract with a builder. I'm going to say, you're going to include this. This is part of what I want. I'm going to buy your solar panels, or I'm going to buy your wind generators, but I'm also going to get this from you. I'm going to make this part of my contract, of my RFP, because you're going to bring this to me. I would do that if I was building a facility today. Last but not least, negotiate a post-commission timeframe. Again, we're all excited. Our facility's up and running. It's great. We're making megawatts. We're cashing checks. Oh, wait a minute. Now there's a discrepancy in a rating, something to do with my inverter. My paperwork says one thing. My nameplate says something else. I need to resolve it. Well, let me call up my manufacturer guy. I call them up and they say, our contract's over. I was like, well, maybe it is, but I still need to ask you this question. And it's like, no, that person's not here anymore. And like, oh, the heck with that. Get that. I would recommend have like at least a 30-day continuation after commercial operations date when you receive the commissioning reports for all of your equipment. Okay, plus I want you to be available for 30, 60 days after that. If something comes up, I want to be able to call you. And this is from direct experience that we've had with folks. Okay, next slide. Last but not least, a lot gets made about internal controls, especially now that the industry is getting to the point where, at least in the generator side, there aren't a whole lot of violations anymore. There's some, always have protection system documentation. Some folks just get behind on. some of the cyber things. Oh, I forgot to get a signature on that plan, whatever. So the auditors are focusing more and more on internal controls, which is fine. That's fine. That helps ensure that you're doing what you need to do. Internal controls aren't mandatory, but they're really a good idea. So let's simplify this a little bit. Yes, if you're some huge multi-state utility with thousands of megawatts generation, thousands of megawatts or thousands of miles of transmission line, then a big document of internal controls and tests and practices might work for you. If you're a renewable generator, you can accomplish the same thing with a few simple documents and steps. The best internal control is a well-functioning compliance program. It doesn't need to be more than 2 or 3 pages long. And that means you take it seriously, but it doesn't mean you have to think about it 24/7. So for low risk entities, that 2 or 3 pages long compliance program is just fine. There are things called reliability standards audit worksheets, RSAWs for short. I was on the standards committee when the standards first became mandatory, and we found out about these documents. And they're auditor tools. They're going to determine, ask a series of questions, request data, request evidence, and to determine your compliance. And thought, man, these are great. And we said, everybody needs to see these. And at that time, the answer was, oh no, you can't see these. These are just for the auditors. And some of us like raising our hand, go, wait a minute, that's not right. We need to be able to see what it is we're being measured against. So the powers that be changed their mind. Okay, RSAWs are available. Everybody can see them. Well, that's great. So now you can get these things filled out at your own leisure ahead of time. You can describe what you do. That's one of the beauties of an RSAW. It does ask you, it doesn't just ask you what you do to comply, it asks you how. And how you do it may be significantly or maybe slightly different than the way somebody else does it. And that latitude is there, that you can describe, this is what we do and this is how we accomplish the goals of the requirement. So it's a great tool. I think it's one of the best controls there is. You get that done, get it answered, get it signed off. That's when it goes back to my comment about the audit. Hey, you're going to be audited. That's fine. We need you to send your RSAWs in 60 days. I can send them to you tomorrow if you want me to. I mean, it's done. Low stress. There's a lot of talk about testing internal controls. Develop a roles and responsibilities matrix. That's one way. Simple spreadsheet. Who does what? Who, what, where, and when. Procedures are another important control. There are standards that require you to have procedures. I mentioned protection system maintenance and testing, facility ratings, event reporting. Part of the requirements are that you have a procedure, but we recommend for everybody, have a procedure for everything that applies to you. And that's a control. And in that procedure, it's going to describe who, what, where, and when is responsible for the requirements. The name of the position that's responsible for this, where the evidence is archived, if it's in a SharePoint site, whatever, just make it easy. And that's another great control. And the controls that keep your program effective, not that hard to do. Once again, pay some attention to these things. And I guess to sum up my part of it, this is not that difficult if you pay some attention to it. I heard the analogy once, I'm going to give you a 55-gallon drum and you have to fill it up with this Dixie cup out of this faucet. And it's like, okay, I want it done by the end of the year. Okay. If I do about 3 or 4 cups a day, and by the end of the year, that barrel's going to be full. If I wait until the day before the end of the year, I have a problem. Mm-hmm. Not that we're not in a position to help people that have gotten themselves in that situation, but it doesn't have to be that way. And so for you folks on this call, the intended audience that may be new to this and that have heard these stories about, oh my gosh, this is horrible. We have to avoid this if possible. Oh, look at all these fines. There haven't been a whole lot of fines for generators. I'd say there's not some, but it's not that difficult. So keep that in mind, and that's my part of it. So Guillermo's going to talk to you a little bit about training and how that's accomplished. So Guillermo, talk to you.
Okay. And thank you, Jim. And as Jim was saying, right, really a lot of this is a people-dependent process, not entirely. You could set up systems, but at the end of the day, really, it's from the upper level, I guess, leadership all the way down to the operators in the field or in the control center. You know, there are some training requirements, right? But really, these are the people that are going to ensure that every action taken, every piece of data that is logged, for example, is properly set up for compliance evidence, right? It's the whole thing, right? So whether you're starting new or you have personnel on board that you're just beginning to get into this business, usually you want to develop consistent training, right? Whether it's your procedures, as Jim mentioned, or even the way all the way up to, for example, your typical cybersecurity training. There is a lot of standards, SIP standards that have to do with cybersecurity training that's required. So the whole point is you're going to train those people anyway. Nobody likes getting hacked. Nobody likes getting get like an attack anyway. And oftentimes those are pretty parallel and analogous to what NERC requires. Just make sure you deliver your training on time, make sure you cover everyone that needs to be covered, and make sure you have evidence that that training was delivered, right? And that's the whole thing. That pretty much covers that second bullet, right? You want to make sure that you have communicated any kind of change, and usually that comes about whether you're doing a change in settings, a change in capabilities, or even a change in how your cybersecurity policy is being deployed or developed, right? Well, those are the things you want to make sure you have clearly documented and that you deliver training on time. Next slide, please. So there are a variety of training methods that can be used to make sure this training is delivered, right? For example, for the most part now, everything seems to be rolled out as a computer-based, self-paced training that anybody can access at any time on any device. That's very convenient. There's something else like what we're doing right now, right? A virtual webinar. Well, in some cases, right, a lot of this is an example of how you can actually log this up as evidence that you attended. Also micro-learning, right? Often you've heard of micro-credentialing. Well, micro-learning is training that can happen 5, 10, 15 minutes once a week or as necessary. What's an example of that? It could be something as simple as an online type of presentation with an online assessment. Well, they went ahead and did that, right? The other thing that's important, I think a question was just asked about that. So we'll get to these big questions later because there's some really good questions rolling in. But this whole thing, right? Holistic awareness, risk management, and senior staff, right? Well, in a lot of cases, right, understanding what that risk really is and getting a good quantification of the risk will help the make better business decisions, right? As Jim said, shying away from an 80 megawatt generator and then just limiting that to 70. I mean, could you be passing up some substantial earnings just to avoid a perceived threat that is maybe perceived in the wrong way when it comes to risk, right? Well, part of that understanding comes through, adequate training on what the standards are and what your responsibilities are, right? On this whole complete awareness of what your compliance risk is. The other important aspect of this, of course, is your operations. I mean, personnel that are at the switchyard, on site, or even the control rooms, communicating with your balancing authority or your transmission operators, those are the ones that require really good training, right? And then to make sure that they communicate properly and then they receive, operate, or respond correctly to any received operating instruction. And we'll get to that more in a minute. The other thing, of course, is your subject matter experts, right? As Jim said earlier, right? Really, your subject matter experts and all the evidence that goes along with it, and the RSAWs, which stands for Reliability Standards Audit Worksheets, really tells you what the requirement is, what your narrative is, and you list your evidence, and then along with that, it tells you what the auditor is exactly looking for, right, as a checklist. So if you read your evidence and your narrative, and you've answered all those questions that the auditor will be looking to check off, you pretty much are ready, and you can maintain this as an ongoing basis where a compliance audit is not even a big to-do when it comes to getting ready. You're constantly ready. So you're always at a state of constant readiness as a matter of fact, everyday business. When audit prep, well, by the time you get there, all you're really doing at this point is basically coaching your SMEs, your subject matter experts, what that evidence is, where it's at, and how often it's updated, right? And then just make sure that they're aware of what the procedures are regarding this. Now, the last thing here, new hire, NERC 101. So part of that is familiarizing, right, all your entire staff, whether it's executive leadership all the way down to the operators and the ones that are making decisions in the field, you know, what NERC is about, what the requirements are, what the importance is of maintaining evidence and storing evidence or logs, or even simple action reports, right, that they have. Or for example, say they had a request from a TOP that, you know, they had a fault on the line and your device performed as intended. Well, they're going to want to know, for example, digital fault recordings. Well, they're going to want to have that provided or at least made available to them. Well, your personnel will know to just not erase those records or just maintain those. Usually that is automated, but you know, it's a matter of importance to just make sure that they're aware of one example of that, or where to find your relay, your system protection commissioning reports, that sort of thing. Next slide, please. Okay, and before we go into the questions, right? One thing that I wanted to bring up is and Jim mentioned this earlier, right? Dealing with, for example, the initial commissioning of a new site. Now, as some of you may have been in the business of doing this quite a bit, some of you are just getting into it, but you have a whole career lifetime ahead of you, right? Of like commissioning new generation sites. There's no reason for it to change. It's just that at this point, right, you will get better with every new site you commission. The important thing to remember, in my experience that I've seen, is one of the biggest challenges is from these construction contractors, right? For the most part, they know what data is being provided and why it's being provided. Typically, that PRC 005, FAC 008, and those standards, for example, that have to deal with the commissioning reports for these relays are of most importance. And but it's important to still demand that they or negotiate a pretty strong contract of making sure that you get clear, accurate, successful reports from all those relays. I've seen examples where they issued a relay test report that showed the relay in a failed mode, but yet they submitted that anyway, and the site was commissioned, right? So that was one example of like an oversight on that contractor in that part. But luckily that relay got retested at some point, and then they were in compliance. But the problem is that it's a matter of making sure the contractors are aware of these requirements, and most of them are, and they're already formatting all of their documentation to be, you know, in compliance to that. The other thing that's important is making sure you're getting clear documentation. I've seen examples that are just somebody just went ahead and got like 300 pages of prints and test records. They stuck it through a document scanner, and they give you this long PDF that has fuzzy documents under that are not optical character recognition, but rather they're just kind of skewed and twisted, and it's an image of a document for each page. That is a problem, right? And that'll definitely frustrate an auditor who's being presented this as evidence, right? So anyway, so thank you. Now I guess we can open up the floor for some questions now. Jim, what do you think?
Yeah, before we do a question, let me fill in something. I'm looking at my notes and I skipped something, and I just want to say something quickly about it. Talk about procedures. What we recommend you have one for every standard that applies to you. If it's more than 1 or 2 pages long, it's too long. For God's sake, don't print the standard and do a search and replace where it says GOP and put your name in it. I've seen procedures that are 40 pages long because people just print the standard and all the reference material in the background and the history. Like, oh my gosh, don't do that. It's simple, straightforward, who, what, where, and when. One exception, for as brief as possible, which is my preference, if you're going to use the procedures as part of training, like you just covered, Guillermo, for some of your 101 people that are coming in, and if you think that they could benefit a little bit from the genesis of why there are these requirements, it's one thing to tell them, hey, you're going to do this, you're going to maintain this list. Sometimes it helps with education to explain a little bit why, and that's perfectly fine. So maybe your procedure needs to be 3 or 4 pages long instead of 1 or 2, if you want to include some of that background. So it's kind of a continuum. You've got desk references, which will be on an index card, or on the other end of the spectrum, you have procedures that are going to have some of the why and the history why there is a standard, basically sort of an expansion of the purpose statement in each of the standards. If you want to do that, that's fine. There's no right or wrong way to do it, but there are some ways that are a lot less work than others. So anyway, I just want to put in those 2 cents about the procedures.
Very good point. Thank you.
Okay.
So Jim, one question came up already. This is really interesting from one of the attendees, and they ask question 1. So why would one go with the 80 megawatt generator instead of the 70 megawatt generator unit? Because as an investor, the resource/cost overhead for compliance, not reliability resilience, and potential fines appear to outweigh the benefits of the 80 megawatt unit based on the premise it will have higher availability.
The risk of fines, sanctions is overstated, in my opinion. Look at the generators, and I said that yes, it's becoming collectively, the IBRs are a huge slice. They're getting bigger all the time, and that's fine. But you're still going to be audited and your compliance assessed on your individual entity. There's a thing I mentioned behind the standards and the reference thing. There's a violation risk factor table that says to what degree that you violated something, like you missed a date, or you missed having a procedure, or you don't even know what the heck they're talking about. To me, I have never seen a huge, significant sanction fine for a generator. People that own fleets of generators, maybe if they have a common registration for all of them, like a multi-region registered entity, but it's just not there. And they're not that hard to comply with. Once again, it's a procedure to do something or evidence you did something. There's nothing a generator can do, a single generator, that's really going to affect the overall performance of the grid. So when they're audited, how to say this? The standards apply to you collectively, you're audited individually. And take advantage of that. And there's no excuse. I think that's overstated. Yes, everybody hear the $1 million a day per violation. Yeah, fine. If you're a utility, I don't see it. I don't think it's that hard to comply with. It's paperwork. It's keeping up. It's keeping track of your communications. It's having a procedure. A generator, a wise person once told me, a generator does 2 things. It makes real power and reactive power. That's all it does. 2 things. So I'm going to manage these 2 things. So I disagree. I don't think the risk of violation is credible to discount megawatts. I would much rather have the added production value.
So Jim, following along with that, right? I have another question that probably ties into that, right? And it was, so what is the time commitment for maintaining compliance with the NERC standards for a generator? Meaning, so I guess this really goes along with like, well, how many hours, how many personnel hours does it take, right, to just maintain compliance between audits?
Once the program is in place, once again, develop a compliance procedure program, get your procedure documents in place, do your training. That takes 40 to 60 hours, maybe. Once again, you're not starting from a blank sheet of paper. You're modifying existing material to fit your situation. After that's done, on an ongoing basis, 6 to 8 hours a month. 6 to 8 hours a month.
6 to 8 hours.
Roughly speaking. We do it all the time. We do it all the time. We get people up and running, got a good program in place. We're just going to keep it running. We're going to monitor it. We're going to make sure that the updates are coming, that if there's something that's happening and you need to have a modification to procedure and you need to train on it. Once again, you have months of notification that needs to happen. Yeah, it's not the same every month. If you get a data request and say, oh, we need to answer this question, we need to make sure we get this right. So that month it may be 10 hours, the next month it may be 2.
Mm-hmm.
So in my experience for IBR scale generators, 6 to 8 hours a month average should be plenty.
Thank you. And another question here that came in was like, what is the scope of a typical audit? And I guess by scope, they mean how many standards? What else are they asking? I mean, so I imagine standards or maybe span of time, how far within the last X amount of years, right? So that's the question. What is the scope of a typical audit?
Scope time-wise, it will either be, let's say, for example, for a new facility being commissioned, the date that your protective system components were tested is the start of a timeline for when they have to be tested again, which is going to be in your protection system maintenance plan, which once again doesn't have to be a lengthy document. It's a time space. So from a time perspective, it's either going to be that from their commissioning date or like commercial operations date to the time of the audit, or for the breadth, kind of that's the length, kind of the breadth of it. In our experience, the standards that are audited follow a lot with the compliance monitoring and enforcement program that comes out every month or every year from NERC, and they identify high-risk standards. So it's generally 3 or 4 standards that you'll be audited on, the high-risk ones. That,
yeah, and it won't be every requirement in the standard, right?
No, you're right. You're right.
I've never seen that where they hit you with every single standard. I mean, every single requirement in the standard. So, and I haven't seen that much either, unless it's like a small standard. Yep. For example, I've seen entities audited on communication standard, right, for like a generator owner, right, a generator operator. Well, there, all that is really, it's if you're a generator operator and you have personnel in your control room who receive an operating instruction from a transmission operator, right, or a balancing authority, basically all they want you to do is understand how to respond to an operating instruction by making sure you do a repeat back. Mm-hmm. They want to make sure you have that training once before they sit on the desk, and that's it. It's only once. So now every operator that sits on the control room needs to have that training prior to being qualified to sit on that control room. But really just a matter of showing them a slide deck on how to or a video on how to do 3-part communications, right? And really they're just receiving instructions, they're not issuing instructions. So it's pretty simple, right? But again, showing the training, showing like a log that they took the training, and showing that they had an assessment that they did it successfully is all you need. And that'll be one example. That's something that they could ask as evidence, right, in this regard. Another one is to make sure you have, for example, adequate test records from either, like Jim said, the initial commissioning, or I think it's every 5-6 years where they decide. And again, that's always up to your procedures. How often are you going to retest those relays? Well, if your one important thing is if you say you're going to do something, you really need to do what you said you were going to do. So again, it is very simple.
And once again, like we talked about, even if there wasn't a NERC standard, you're probably going to do something like that. Mm-hmm. I mean, you have a very expensive and valuable resource. You're going to make sure that the protective devices that help keep it running are in good shape. I don't care if there's a NERC standard or not.
Right. You always want to make sure you're going to protect your equipment. So you're going to have good relay settings. You're going to test your relays. If, for example, your microprocessor-based relay decides to put in a patch or an upgrade, well, you know what? You might want to test them as well if you're doing that, right? And usually you're going to outsource that. There's a good likelihood that's going to be outsourced. You're going to have a contractor come in to do that. Well, for them, hooking up Adobe or running a test program, giving you the output on a nice PDF file, that shows them having a successful test on those relays, or maybe even testing the breakers that go along with that. Well,
yep,
that's evidence you can use to present that. And if they need to go test their CTs, for example, would they do that once every 8, 9, 10, 12 years in some cases, right? Well, hey, you retain that evidence as well. In a lot of cases, most of these contractors are already aware of these standards, because in a lot of cases they're already doing work for entities that already are subject to these regulations standards and requirements. So they're already producing data, or rather outputs that are in the format that the auditors recognize, and they're easier for you to sort, right?
Exactly.
But always important to make sure you ask that, right?
It's either a procedure to do something or evidence you did something.
Right.
One of those two things.
Right. And I think so. So the other one, so the other question here was like, how do we manage the required initial training versus the required ongoing training, right, or continuous training? The initial training, I think, is ideally you want to get that before you're live, or before if it's personnel, before they are qualified to sit on the desk. And that should be, this training should be part of the qualification process, right? That's the initial training. Or whenever you have a new hire, right, and you want to get them set up and ready or qualified for the job, well, all this initial training is part of their IDP, their individual development plan. And NERC has a whole set of requirements, training requirements across different standards. COM-001 and 002 are just two standards that deal with communications. There's a few others that deal with like TOP, emergency operation, that sort of thing, right? That have to do with training requirements as well, but they're not that many. In fact, your plant site operators don't need to be NERC certified, right? So that's another example where you don't need to go get a NERC certification to do what you're doing, right? They just need to have initial training in some cases and documentation. The one that gets really important, I think, is the cybersecurity stuff. That becomes a big deal, not for a number of reasons, right? Especially if you're somehow connected or supply data, SCADA data to your TOP or even your reliability coordinator. That becomes important. But and then when it comes to and that ties right into the whole continuing education part, right? Where changes in the standards. And mind you, I mean, a change in a standard, a change in a requirement to a standard, you'll know years ahead of time. And hopefully you'll even be part of the process where you get to vote on whether this change should happen or not, right? So you'll know way ahead of time what's coming. And if you're ready for it, you'll be prepared for this change, long before the standard comes in, becomes effective. So.
Agreed.
All right. Do we have any other questions here? Any other discussions? I believe this webinar is being recorded and then will be presented later on and made available to all the participants. And but as always, we're all here to available to help. I think you have our contact info down there as well, Jim Stanton and myself. So we're always happy to answer any of your questions if you decide to reach out.
Guillermo, thank you. And Jim, thank you so much. This has been fantastic. I think our audience is absolutely engrossed. They're all hanging on the line. For our audience, though, we do hope you've enjoyed today's presentation. If you have further questions for our panel, certainly reach out to them directly. You can always email us here at Energy Central, but we really appreciate the opportunity to bring this important information to you. As you log off, please take a moment to complete our survey and give us your feedback so we can continue to provide you with quality content. Thank you for attending, speakers. Thank you for coming on today. This concludes today's presentation.